because I'm trying to re-record this training that we did this past weekend. So as many of you know, lots of people are working remotely and Zoom is having lots of issues. So this is my third time around recording this training session for us. Hopefully it stays on. I am monitoring from here. So if you guys have any questions, post them in the comments. I don't know how I can try to monitor them, the comments, without speaking. So if you have comments and if I'm not able to get to them, please put your comments, your questions in the comments and I'll get back to them. So the training that we did this past Sunday was part 2 of business analysis case study for an interview process. So lots of employers out there are requesting people to do case studies. I haven't seen that much in the United States, but maybe in India and the UK area and Australia, employers are requesting people to do case studies. So with that, this is what we covered this past weekend. I posted in the group today. Let me share my screen. Oh. So I posted in the group our first session that we did on the training for the case study, right? So in the first session, we covered just the basics. How do you think about a case study? How do you prepare for it? And in this past week's training, we started to create some of the documentations that they requested as part of the case study. So just a quick overview. I'll go over really quickly what this case study is about, and then we'll go into the details of the case study, okay? So I'll do that just in a bit. Okay, so this case study is for an XYZ a nonprofit organization. Let me, here it is. XYZ nonprofit organization, it's a US-based nonprofit, and they serve old people worldwide to alleviate social isolation. What they wanted to do was to develop a robust and responsive software solution to help the internal staff to manage associated old people and the volunteer social worker activities program-wise, which include their onboarding into the organization and their eligibility to participate or contribute in the program. So when you're going for your interview and your employer is requesting that you do a case study, they're outlining some sort of an issue or problem that you are trying to solve for them. So when you are assigned to a case study, the goal of the case study is to ensure that you guys have a proper understanding of business analysis and that you have the ability to put your analytical thinking caps on and to come up and analyze what those, what the situation or what problem that company or that client is facing, and that you understand the business challenges and the project scope. You can identify business requirements, you can create workflow diagrams, and you can handle like half-baked solutions, because that's what business analysts do on a day-to-day, right? It is up to business analysts to ask the right questions to properly understand and document what the systems or enhancements or projects that they're working on need to entail. So that's why some employers are going the route of presenting a case study to you to see if you can think through the logical steps that you need to present back to them and showcase your understanding of your role as a business analyst, right? What it's not is it's not there to trick you. And it's not to see if you can get the right or wrong answer, because whatever issue or problem they're providing to you is something that they either already have solved or something that is big enough to give you an understanding of some of the works of the organization. Okay, so again, really quickly, we covered this in part 1. So if you're just watching part 2, go back to the first week's training, previous week's training, and watch part 2 of this. So in part 1, we talked about where do you get started in preparing for a case study. We talked about how important it is to document your assumptions. If you can go back and request or have the ability to go back to your interviewer or your HR contact to ask questions for the case study, do it. If not, based on what you're reading as the case study, document what your assumptions are, because that narrows down or alleviates the scope. So that way you can focus on one issue that you're trying to solve in the case study, okay? So it's really, really important to document your assumptions. And for us, I said the current system is now web-based, data is entered manually, program or events are published via postal mail, and then volunteers and social workers only provide the service of transport to local programs. So I will also post the PDF for the case study that we use so you can get some background info on it. But by putting the last bullet on there, volunteers and social workers only provide the service of transport to local programs. I've narrowed this down quite a bit. I've narrowed and reduced the scope of the project that we're working on and the scope of the XYZ organization, just so that I can focus on one problem and solve it completely and showcase my ability to understand and to provide solutions. Okay, so that's why I've done that. Overall, when I was analyzing the case study, it seemed like there's 3 inputs that are coming into the XYZ organization, and then it says old people. I should have changed it, but the inputs are volunteers that are willing to work for the organization. You have the social workers, and then you have the local departments and programs that participate within the XYZ organization. And then the output or the customers seem like they're the senior citizens. Okay. Last week, part 1 of the training, we walked through the as-is workflow, as it seems based on my assumption that XYZ organization is only providing transport to the senior citizens, and it is the volunteers and the social workers that are providing that transport as on behalf of XYZ to the senior citizens. So again, my as-is workflow is based on my assumptions, and that's why it's really important and critical that you document your assumptions when you're doing your case study, because they can help you streamline your scope. So also part of phase 1 or part 1 of the case study, we together as a group identified requirements that we thought were valid for this project. So the overall goal was to have an organization, XYZ organization is looking for an end-to-end solution, but we outlined 1 through 6 requirements, and in some of the artifacts that they're looking for, they wanted us to dive deep in one business process. So for us to, what we made is we selected number 4, registration and matching for local volunteers and social workers. So what we did was we decided to dive deep in those requirements, and that's what we'll be using to create our artifacts that are needed to submit as part of this case study. So as a group, we selected this one, and now I'll go into the details of this training. And I just want to make sure that we're still going live. Okay, we are. So for part 2, and this is what we covered this past Sunday. So the deliverables that are due for this case study, they wanted us to create a business process diagram. They wanted us to describe what that business process diagram was. They wanted us to write business rules, write functional requirements, and then pick any sub-process of that module and write user stories or case studies. And then also to create prototypes of one complete process, okay? So these are things that were required for us to submit as part of us completing this. So before we get started, again, just an overview and reading requirements. Here's an overview of what the client wants. And before you can create a process flow, just hang on one second, you guys. Okay, sorry about that, you guys. I'm working from home and the kids are home, so I needed to check up on them. Okay, so going back, before, so part of their artifacts that they want us to provide is to provide a business process diagram. Now you can only create business process diagrams from requirements, right? So if you don't have those requirements, how can you create a business process diagram? So this is what we did here is we went through and we outlined requirements. These are some of those requirements. And from there, we were able to create a process diagram that we'll go through. But here, let's go through the requirements. And the whole goal of them wanting you to document business processes and documenting requirements is so that they can see the logical flow in the way that you're thinking about requirements, right? So if you were to just create a business process diagram without going through the process of generating requirements, which help you create the business process flow, it just wouldn't look as robust, or it wouldn't follow that logical progression that typically you would if you're sitting there and trying to think of how, as somebody who works for the XYZ organization, would operate. So one of the questions that I got over the weekend was, how did you create these requirements? And my response was, well, not knowing anything about this organization, if they're servicing older people, senior citizens, you would want to try to do as much as you can to make sure that they're safe, right? So most of these requirements are around, making sure the volunteers and social workers are able to take care of, not to take care of, but they have done a background check and they've done a drug test, because we want to make sure that our customers, who in this scenario are senior citizens, are going to be safe, right? We're not putting them in harm's way by just providing, transport to them. And as we know, our senior citizens are most of the time at a state where they're very vulnerable or they're very lonely. So we don't want to endanger them in any way. So here are the requirements that we have. And based on the requirements, we'll talk about the business process flow. So the requirements is, one of them is registrations for volunteer and social workers and senior citizens is available online, either on a website or a mobile app. The main office of XYZ organization has workstations available to fill out the application online for volunteers, social workers, and senior citizens. And then XYZ also has Alexa voice system to intake application via phone and provide general information. And as we know, if our audience, which is senior citizens, they're a little bit older, they usually prefer phone interaction rather than apps and websites. So some of the other requirements are volunteers and social workers must pass a background check. Once the application for volunteer social worker is approved, only then can they be matched with a volunteer within a 20-mile radius. Background includes criminal record and a drug test. Approval and rejection of application is communicated via email or the app push app notification to volunteers and social workers. Requirements for senior citizens, 65 years plus, U.S. citizen or permanent resident of the United States. And once the volunteer social worker is approved, they must be matched. They can be matched up to 5 times a month. And the last bullet on this slide is all matches take place the first Monday of a given month. Volunteers and social workers have to provide confirmation via email by the second Monday of a given month. And there's a few more. Volunteers and social workers must be at least 18 years in age, and they must have a valid driver's license plus personal mode of transportation. And volunteers and social workers must complete 10 hours of online training prior to the matching process. So now, again, if we think about the requirements, these are all made up, right? We don't know anything about the XYZ organization besides the information that we were provided. So how then have we come up with these requirements? And it's only if you put yourself in the shoes of the XYZ organization and you sit down to think, okay, well, if this organization or if this company is servicing the older demographics, how do you protect them? How do you make sure that they're in the hands of good, diligent people? So here are just some of the requirements that we put in place, again, to highlight the registration and matching process only, right? That's what we wanted to dive deep on. So all of these requirements are around the registration and matching process. Okay, let's keep moving forward. So then we did create a workflow diagram. Just give me 1 second and I'll pull that up. It's right here. So based on what we just spoke about, the requirements that we gathered, here's the business process diagram that aligns with those requirements. So first you have, you start from here. Typically when you're creating workflow diagrams, there's 3 typical shapes that you should know about. The start or terminator is an oval. This rectangle represents a business process, and this diamond represents a decision point. So if you know these basic diagrams, then you'll be able to kind of work your way through a business process diagram. So let's start here. We see the start. We see that there's 3 ways of submitting an application, and everybody has to submit an application to go through the registration process. So there's a website, there's a mobile app, and then there's Alexa voice to intake the application, which starts the registration process from this business process diagram here. And we go to the first decision point that we see. It says, are you a volunteer/social worker, or are you a senior citizen? Because there's different processes for both of them, right? If you're a senior citizen, you're gonna ask them qualifying questions for senior citizens, which when we go back to our PowerPoint for senior citizens, our qualifying questions are you 65 years older, at least 65 years old or above? Are you a US citizen, or are you a permanent resident of the United States? Okay, so once you go through asking the qualifying questions, the decision point here is, do you qualify to be a senior citizen? If the answer is no, if they don't meet those 3 criteria, then we give them a message that you don't qualify, and we bring them down to the end state. Now, if they do qualify, we request info on the application. We start their onboarding process, and we start the matching process for them. And once they match, we're also bringing them to an end, because we're only focusing for this case study to dive deep just on the registration and the matching process. Okay, now let's go back to the earlier decision point. Are you a volunteer, social worker, or senior citizen? We move here this way, volunteer, social worker. You again ask them qualifying questions. And in this scenario, our qualifying questions are you at least 18 years in age? Do you have a valid driver's license plus personal mode of transportation? And then also you have to, I think we go into the drug test later. Okay, so the qualifying questions, if they don't match it, we give them the same standard message, and we bring them to the end of the decision point. If they do match the qualifying questions, they fill out the application. They send, we send the applicant to get a criminal background check. If they pass a criminal background check, we proceed with the application. If they don't pass, then we can send them back the non-qualifying response, and we end the process. If they do pass the criminal background check, then they go for the drug test. They pass, then we start the onboarding process plus required training, and then we start the matching process. So again, what we try to do is, sorry, I'm using the wrong one. What we try to do here in this workflow, process flow, is to identify things that we gathered as requirements. So going back to the things that we needed to submit. These are the deliverables that we needed to provide. So we now have created the business process diagram. All right, let's go on to number 2. Here is, they wanted a write-up of the diagram, so I've quickly just documented that, just saying that the registration process applies to all participants of the XYZ organization. So everything that we just talked about, I just wrote it out. I'll start from here. Registration process differs for for senior citizens and volunteers/social workers, such that there are a lot more regulatory guidelines for individuals who are taking care of and supporting senior citizens, and therefore the following processes are outlined for registration for both senior citizens as well as volunteers and social workers. So again, they just want to see from the interviewer standpoint that you're able to outline the process in diagrams, right, that we just looked at, as well as in written format. So here I've just identified some of the business processes. For senior citizens, we ask them qualifying questions, they fill out the form, we start the onboarding process and the matching process. And for the volunteers, social workers, we answer the qualifying questions, fill out the registration form, complete the background check, we complete the drug test, the onboarding process, and the matching process. Okay. Again, if you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Now, another requirement that they have is to document or write the business rules. Business rules are a little bit different than business requirements. Business requirements are things at the project level that need to happen to complete the project, but business rules are overarching things that you must have, right? Business rules are at the business level, what things need to exist for this business to operate, right? So they're much bigger than a project. They're at the business level. So what we call them are must-haves. So the reason why they wanted you to document the business rules for this case study is they want to understand that you understand the difference. So here are some of the business rules that we've documented, the requirements. Some of the business rules are requirements for senior citizens must be 65 years plus, U.S. citizen and permanent resident of the United States. Volunteer and social workers must pass background check prior to application getting approved. The background check includes a criminal record and a drug test. Social workers and volunteers must be at least 18 years in age, and they must also have a valid driver's license and personal mode of transportation. So think about the XYZ organization and think about this, I guess, website being a project. So the website is a project, but these 5 things that we've listed, they're the way that XYZ operates and conducts business. So these from a standpoint are business rules. So if, let's say, we're building a website, you know, the requirements for the website may change based on the technology that we're using, or, you know, if there's a new way of submitting applications 5 years from now, again, those requirements will change, but these business rules will not, because this is the way that they do business. So that's why they're called business rules as opposed to business requirements. Okay. They also wanted us to document the functional requirements, and we've done this last week as a group. And so I'll go over these, and I think this is the last thing that we're going to cover in part 2. For part 3, we'll be talking about user stories and then prototyping stuff. So that's what you'll be looking forward to in part 3. So for functional requirements are written in a format of like, so in the waterfall environment, their format is the system shall or the system should, right, format. And if you're in the agile environment, that's when you have user stories. So in this case study, they wanted us to write functional requirements, which is this format that you see here. Next week, next Sunday, for part 3 of this case study, we'll be writing user stories. So you guys can see the different format in how we write requirements, okay? So here they're saying write functional requirements, and we did this as a group this past Sunday, so I'll just go over this. One of the functional requirements was the registration page shall have a form to capture complete information for applicant applying to be a volunteer / social worker for the XYZ organization, right? So obviously, you know, when you have registration, there's some sort of a form to capture the required information. And that's what this functional requirement is saying. The system must allow the process for volunteers and social workers to pass a background check prior to the application getting approved. And the next one is the system must register all applicants requiring qualifying questions to validate basic requirements for participation. When it comes to the senior citizens, it's these qualifying questions. When it comes to volunteers / social workers, it's these qualifying questions. And then the last one functional requirement that we listed was the system shall communicate approval or rejection of the application, social workers or volunteers via email or app push notifications within 48 hours of the background plus drug test. Again, the reason why we're listing them, and it's not to get the right answer or the wrong answer when you're working on these case studies, is to show progression of requirements, right? So if you go back to when we first started, this is all that we knew about this case study. And from there, we broke it down into documenting, understanding the overall organization, understanding how they're maybe doing things as today, as is, or this is the as is workflow. From here, we outlined requirements for the system, and then we outlined requirements for the specific module that we wanted to focus on, which was registration and matching. Once we did that, we created a workflow diagram for registration and matching. And now we're documenting the business rules, and then we're documenting the functional requirements. So this is a complete progression of requirements, right? Next week, what we'll cover is part 3, which is we'll write user stories for the functional requirements that we already created. We'll do prototype of the complete process, and then we'll also talk about how you want to present and submit your case study. So this was something that was requested by one of the people in the group. I believe Arvind requested that we do this case study. So what I just went over today is part 2 of a 3-part series to showcase how you would, when you are assigned a case study, how you would go through the thinking process and the logical flow of how to present your ideas from a project standpoint. So I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have questions, put them in the comments. If you haven't seen the other training session part 1, I posted that earlier today, so you should have that available to you. This is part 2, and then we'll have this coming Sunday, we'll do part 3 of this training series, okay? Again, sorry for all the technical difficulties that we're having right now, but hopefully third time is a charm, and hopefully we won't have to do this again. All right, guys, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your questions in the group and your participation. That's what makes it fun. Again, if you have questions, let me know in the group. With that, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.